And he looked at me with the most hateful eyes. I fumbled and got those things together just like I was told and handed them to him. And he walked away to his car, and I just started sobbing. I was so broken. I couldn't believe that God would allow that to happen to me. It was in that moment where I felt free, and I felt released from the rules I'd put on myself. And I was able to better understand that it's not just thinking about controlling and changing other people, it's about allowing Jesus to change them. I can remember growing up on a farm with my family. We had 19 acres. We were a really close family. My mom was a teacher. My dad was an engineer. We would go on camping trips. We had dinner together. So I was raised in the church and baptized as an infant. My parents took us to church every Sunday, and it was a really meaningful part of our family. I was also the firstborn, so I had two younger siblings, and I took on all of the typical characteristics of an oldest child. Very responsible, very dependable. In fact, I got that superlative when I was in high school. And very much a rule follower. God gave me an extra measure of compassion, which I needed for the times when I would keep my siblings, and they would break the heads off the statues in our house, and I'd have to glue them back together before my parents got home. But that gift of compassion was something that was treasured in the beginning. My dad was a really compassionate man, still is. And I identified with him in that character trait. But I would learn that that was a hard character trait to have in the world. And I would learn that in interactions with those who are the closest to me and my family. I was struck by a kind of change in the way I view my compassion in an instance that happened this past November. I was leaving the hospital after caring for my mom, who had recently been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And we were traveling out of town to be together as a family. And I had left the hospital, left my dad. He had arrived hopeful that my mom could share a Thanksgiving dinner with him. And it was quickly apparent that she wasn't in that place. But my dad, in his compassionate ways, said, "You need to go on home. You haven't seen your kids all day. Thank you for being here with Mom, but I've got it now." So I left and was really dreary, groggy. I had seen things and heard things and experienced my medical background in different ways when you watch your family member go through the things that she went through that day and night. So I was pretty raw. I was driving down the road, and I was out of town, so I really wasn't paying attention. I missed my turn. So I was following my GPS, and it had a turnaround. So of course I'm following the GPS, and as we do with our technology these days, really thankful I had that. My eyes were tired, and so I was squinting a little bit, and as I came up on the turn, I saw that there was a sign that said, authorized vehicles only. So I slowed down, and I had that last minute, firstborn, oh my goodness, I'm not going to follow the rules. What am I going to do? And then I decided it was better to just go ahead and turn. And immediately after I turned, there were blue lights right behind me, which is something that oddly enough, every time I felt like every time I didn't follow the rules, there would be a consequence, and that kind of perpetuated my rule following. And I just was, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that after that day and after what had happened, that I would be pulled over. And you know, they always tell us the first thing you do is tell them you're sorry. I mean, I had made a mistake. So I came to the window and I rolled down the window. I said, I am so, so sorry. I'm from out of town. I just came from the hospital. My mom is really sick. I was following my GPS and showed him my GPS. It absolutely was exactly what I said. And he looked at me with the most hateful eyes and said, license and registration. And I fumbled and got those things together just like I was told and handed them to him. And he walked away to his car, and I just started sobbing. I was so broken. I couldn't believe that God would allow that to happen to me in that moment. I had developed a really good coping mechanism of not crying. Not really good, I'm being sarcastic. And so compartmentalization was how I had dealt with some really hard things in my life. So I didn't cry usually, and so this was new for me. And it was not just a little tear or two of sobbing. I just was broken. He came back to the car and he said, you know, in Virginia, if you turn in an unauthorized space, that is a mandatory court appearance. And I'm sobbing, just sobbing. And I said, I'm so sorry. Between tears, I'm so sorry. I don't know what else to tell you. My mom's dying. I'm out of town. Give me the ticket, And he said, get out of here before you cause an accident. So I did, and honestly, I would have much rather him have given me a ticket than to have treated me in that way. And I would go home and skip dinner. Didn't do Thanksgiving dinner. I went to bed. And it's something that really struck me. I can tell you about this story. I can tell you about the police officer. I can tell you how bad it hurt. What's harder for me to talk about is the hurt that has been caused in my own family. It's hard to talk about, especially when you are a person who embodies compassion. I always want to think about the goodness in other people, and I always want to try really hard to utilize all the things I've learned from my nurtured conversion. I know that Jesus is kind and compassionate, and I want to allow him to live through me and how I engage with people who don't act like I hope they would, or hurt me. I would be accused of causing my mom to be ill by allowing her to come on the trip. My medical professional judgment would be questioned when I made the decision to have 911 called for my mother, whose blood pressure ended up being 57 over palpable, which you don't have to be in medicine to know that it's really not very compatible with much more life. And empty promises would be made. I would be left alone with my really sick mother and my dad, who was spiraling. So those moments of realization of my reality and the hard truth of it made me think about other people who might have hard spaces in their own lives that we don't really talk about in the church. We don't talk about a lot of really hard mental illnesses. We don't talk about alcoholism and other addictions. But when you have people like that in your life and you repeatedly live in the circle and cycle of their dysfunction, it's really difficult to have the church face on every day. A turning point for me that I hope might help other people is when I went and spoke with our senior pastor, Ray Cobb. I had been through years of my own therapy, trying really hard to change myself. That's what we learn in therapy, changing ourselves and not trying to control the behavior of others, which is really hard. But there was always a piece of my therapy that I didn't have because though my therapist is a Christian, she wasn't my pastor. So I went in and talked to Ray, and I had talked to him several times about this, and I just was beating myself up. Just, Ray, I always think about the parable of the prodigal son. I'm the older son. I'm the older son, beating myself up. Like, how can I be like a Pharisee? Why am I not happy when they come home? And he looked at me with the most compassion that I needed in that moment, and it stuck with me. And he said, I want you to think about the parable of the man at the healing well. And I want you to ask yourself this question: do they want to be healed? You're not the older brother. It was in that moment where I felt free, and I felt released from the rules I'd put on myself. And I was able to better understand that it's not just thinking about controlling and changing other people. It's about allowing Jesus to change them and really rejoicing when that happens. But in the meantime, on the journey when it's really difficult to be in the midst of cycles of dysfunction or people who don't want to change, being there for them when you can, but also trusting Jesus with them. That's a lot of letting go, a lot of childlike faith. I've recently taught a Sunday school class here and felt like it was a really pivotal time for me to kind of share some of this in that class. And one of the things I encouraged the participants to do was to think about Jesus looking at them as a child. And that vision is what came to me that day as well. And when I get into cycles of worry and wondering how is this ever gonna be resolved, I just think about Jesus looking at me as a child and smiling and taking over all of the adult fears, all of the adult control, the adult responsibilities, and just shining his compassion on me. If your story is hard to share, you're not alone. And Jesus knows your story, and he'll know when it's time for you to share it. He'll also know if that's not a good time to share it. But I hope in some way that my sharing those really deep, dark places that aren't healed, that I can't tell you a beautiful recovery story. I can't tell you we're going to go to the beach together this summer. What I can tell you is that Jesus is in the midst of the story of my life and my family's life, and will continue to be, and I can promise the same for you.